First off, I'll say that this comp requires much better gear than the other comps. I would not recommend running this comp unless you have a good pool of gear ready. Bare minimum, you need 4 immunity sets, 1 per unit, and you also need either a max limit Broken Spirit's Breath or just a really fast Vivian. At least 260 speed. I ran 265 and 266 and those both worked well. You could probably go a couple speeds slower, but I'm not sure by how much. I've been really wanting to try this comp out ever since we saw that Wukong had a healing device in his preview video, because that would remove the need for a healer. The boss uses S2 at the start of the fight, but that doesn't strip, so we can just block it with immunity set. And then by making Vivian really fast or using Spirit's Breath, we can have it so that she always puts immunity up when the boss uses S2 and just block the skill completely without having any cleanses. This lets us run a 4th DPS instead of a healer like Ray or Bernard, and this would up our damage a lot and let us hit certain one-shot breakpoints earlier. For me, my team was getting a 100% one-shot at RC8. Typically, with a Wukong, Vivian, Bellona, and healer team, you'd start 100% one-shotting at RC15. You don't really save that much energy, but it is kind of fun to run 4 DPS and not a healer. First up is Wukong. For Wukong, range or destruction sets work fine. You can see which one gives you the stats you need, and also have immunity set. Besides attack, crit chance, and crit damage, you are also going to need a little bit of bulk. The reason for this is because the boss opens with S2 into S1, and you're going to need to tank both hits. One thing you could do is, if you're really struggling with getting enough bulk, you can give Wukong enough speed so that he moves 3rd in your turn order and also cuts Rift, so that he can hit the boss with the healing device and heal up between the S2 and the S1. Keep in mind, Wukong also gets 20% speed after getting hit when the boss uses S2 at the very start, so you can add 20% to his speed when you're doing any calculations. I don't have enough bulk to survive, but Victorious Flag gives me 16% damage reduction, so I'm able to survive the hits. I recommend getting enough bulk if you can, and swapping to Sigurd's Scythe if you also have a spare Bloodstone available. Sigurd's Scythe plus Bloodstone lets you drop the healing device on row 1, and switch it over to the damage device instead, which would be a much larger damage increase than any artifacts that we could use on Wukong or Bellona. I wasn't able to get enough bulk without stealing gear from my PvP units, so I just went a slightly lower bulk with Victorious Flag instead. For speed, I've seen people do attack percent main boots. I prefer speed main boots. Either one works fine. And crit chance can go as low as 93% because Bellona Adin gives 7% crit chance to all allies. For Molas, since we run him skills off, S3 isn't needed, but if you use him in PvP, S3 Molas are nice there. Wukong S1 is doing most of our damage. Wukong's going to be doing like 50% of the damage himself, so S1 Molas are nice to have. And S2 Molas are good because the boss has 50% crit chance, so without maxing his S2, there's a slight chance you get crit, and also the pen resistance helps reduce the damage from S1 as well. Next up, we've got Bellona. So for Bellona, it kind of depends. If you're really cheaping out on her Molas, I'd just grace her. I didn't max her S2 and S3 until I hit RC8. At RC1 and 2, I had nothing in S2 and only up to +4 in S3. If you have enough damage, you could actually just go +3 for the -1 turn cooldown or skip it completely, because one, Adin also has 100% death break, so only being 85% death break isn't as bad, and also you could simply have enough damage where you don't need death break. Having 4 DPS allows us to do that very early on in this comp, as soon as RC2 for 100% 2-shot, and at RC8 you can hit 100% 1-shot. So death break isn't necessarily mandatory if you have enough damage. For EE, you want the -1 turn E so she can S2 every other turn. Artifact, like I mentioned earlier, if you have Bloodstone, that's nice to pair with the Sigurd's Scythe, so you can swap from the healing E or the healing device to the damage device on row 1. Aside from that, any damage boosting artifact works fine. And then 93% crit chance. Effectiveness, you want at least 105 if you're death break reliant. If you're skipping death break and going for just a 100% consistent 2-shot instead, then you can drop all of this for damage stats to increase the odds that you're able to get a consistent 2-tap going. Speed, if you want her to move after Vivian, aside from that, it doesn't really matter who goes where, especially if you're doing it so that you're not using Death Break. You can have it so that Bellona or Adin goes first. Mine is set up so it goes Vivian, Bellona, Adin, and then Wukong. Now we've got Adin. Adin, damage boosting artifact. Speed and immunity sets. Could also go Destruction. 93% crit chance. Effectiveness, same thing as Bellona. Only need effectiveness if you want Death Break. I could have skipped it, but I chose not to because I wanted to see if I could one-shot before RC8. Didn't happen, but it was worth a shot. At RC8, I did drop the effectiveness, and I'll show the builds for both Bellona and Adin there without any effectiveness on them. Speed doesn't really matter whether her or Bellona go first, as long as you're after Vivian. And then all of this stuff, her skill enhancements and her skill tree stuff, are free from completing story and doing her missions. And lastly, we've got Vivian. Also, one thing, Vivian, I forgot I had her imprints, so you're going to see the team slots are a little bit weird in RC 2 and 3. I didn't realize this until RC 8. Positioning does matter if you have Vivian imprints for some strange reason. So for Vivian, S3, -1 turn cooldown is mandatory. You need the reduced cooldown. And for S2, the damage is nice. It's not mandatory. She is doing a good amount. Wukong's doing most of it. If you need this to help push you into a consistent one-shot or two-shot, you can pick this up. I had it molded already for Banshee 13 one-shot. And then, so the core of this comp centers around Vivian being able to give us a permanent immunity buff. One way to do that is with the Max Limit Broken Spirit's Breath. If you don't have a Max Limit Broken, I'd recommend not running this at 97.5% because you're probably going to die. I think it might be 95%. At 95%, you're probably going to die. You'd probably want to run the high speed version instead, or just run a comp with a healer instead of Adin. Speed, make sure she's going first. You're going to want speed set and immunity set to do that. Crit chance, 93%. Rest the stats into damage. And then for EE, this one kind of depends on how fast your team is or what cycling you're doing, because I'll show it in a run really quick in a bit, but I found that the 50% CR push EE slightly reduced my damage, so I swapped to the Dispel one instead. If you find that you need the 50% CR push, then you should use that. And here is the alternative Vivian build for people who don't have a Max Limit Broken Spirit's Breath. You're going to want the 50% CR push EE combined with a lot of speed. I found that 265 is a pretty good number to be at or around. That combined with the CR push on her S1, you don't need to mold it, but the CR push on her S1 essentially gives her an extra turn, making up for the -1 turn from Spirit's Breath. Not completely, because the thing about Spirit's Breath is it lets you completely skip the turn, and in Rift, you have Rift Counterforce, which limits the amount of turns you can take. So taking that extra turn is going to lower our damage, because Vivian just tosses out a useless little S1, and it's a turn that could have been better used on somebody else. But if you don't have a Max Limit Broken Spirit's Breath and you want to go 4 DPS, that's what you gotta do. Pretty much the same thing, 93% crit chance, a lot more speed than before, and the rest of the stats into crit damage and attack. And for Artifact, I like Cauldra. Don't go Etika since you want consistent S3 timings, and if you have a Max Limit Broken Spirit's Breath, the other build is way easier to gear. So for RC1, the boss starts at 25% HP, so it's pretty much trivial to kill. You don't have your healing device yet, so you might want to give Wukong a healing artifact, or just put in a healer instead of Adin for safety. Even if you miss Death Break, you'll still kill fine, no problem. Now that you hit RC2, we're going to be able to head out and grab our first device. Generally, you want the healing one whenever Wukong attacks. This enables you to run no healer and not die. If you have Sigurd Scythe and a Bloodstone and enough bulk on Wukong to survive the first 2 hits, then you can take the one on the right instead, which increases your damage dealt. During my first fight, I realized that I actually don't like the 50% CR push E on Vivian, because she puts up the immunity buff a little bit before Adin gets to move on an earlier turn, and now Adin gets hit with the unbuffable here. The unbuffable doesn't matter on Wukong because Vivian's not buffing him anytime soon, but for Adin, her S3 personal buff, weakness shared, isn't going to get applied yet, So Wukong's going to do slightly less damage on this last S1 here. So I finished off the run to not waste my energy, and I was rewarded with my pet proccing, so I ended up getting pushed instantly into RC3. So the run you see coming up is going to be at RC3, not RC2. So now let's take a look at the full run. The fight starts and the boss uses S2, but we have 4 immunity sets, so we just block all the debuffs. Vivian gives us our immunity buff back and attack buff, with Bellona and Adin both having a 100% chance death break on their S3. If you factor in 15%, they have a 97.75% chance to land at least one death break here. And we miss both in classic E7 fashion. So the thing is, I could have just removed all the effectiveness off of Bellona and Adin, because by the end of the run, it was pretty clear that even if we landed no death breaks, we would still get 50%. I do land one with Adin later, but it wasn't necessary for me to get to 50%. The reason I don't do that is because I was curious whether or not I could one-shot it without death break, or with death break before RC8. The answer is no, but I think if you went like if you went 4 rage sets on everybody, and you land death break at the start and after the boss uses S3, you could be able to one-shot. I don't have that many rage sets. One thing to mention though is, if you are short on damage, and you need at least one death break to land somewhere in the run, Adin has a really nice cycling going on, where after the boss uses S3 and removes where a death break would have been, Adin has another chance to land death break right here. So by the end of the run, we find ourselves with 100% consistent 2-shot, because even with Adin's death break here, we wouldn't have needed it to get past 50% HP. Bellona gets her death break resisted again. And you can see here that Wukong's immunity buff wears off, but Adin still has hers. So this is why we switched our EEs from the 50% CR push one to the cleanse one. And also you can see somehow Wukong resisted every single debuff from S2. The power of 15%. Adin manages to get her weakness shared debuff here, giving Wukong slightly more damage on his S1. So now we've hit RC8 and we can back out and grab our second device. It's going to be the rightmost device, the warrior device, which lets you extend debuffs when using AoEs. What this lets us do is, if you still need death break, at the start of the fight, you can give yourself a 97.75% chance to land death break, and Wukong can infinitely extend it until the end of the fight, as well as any sever stacks. So coming into RC8, I thought, when I did the team with Wukong, Bellona, Vivian, and Bernard, I was already one-shotting with death break at RC8. But now we have Adin, an extra DPS instead of a pretty useless healer. So what if we try one-shotting without death break instead? To do this, I did change 2 of their builds. For Adin, you just drop all of her effectiveness and put it into damage instead. You do want to make sure that you're maintaining the right level of speed going after Vivian. And same thing for Bellona pretty much. You are also just going to drop as much effectiveness as you can for damage. Keep in mind, the EE's main stat is effectiveness, so you're going to have some effectiveness. Doesn't really matter, because the point isn't to hit 0 effectiveness, it's just that effectiveness isn't a prioritized stat anymore. And make sure that you're going after Vivian as usual. Also make sure you're keeping immunity set on both of them in case you forgot. So for the RC8 run, there's not really anything special to say. You'll see that once we start landing sever stacks, every third time Wukong attacks, he'll extend them, and throughout the fight, we'll have a pretty consistent stock of sever stacks going. This increases our damage enough that we can just completely ignore death break and get 100% one-shot going at RC8.
시전 완료. 가볼까요?
오합 기절이고
꽤 아플 거야.
예의는 배로 주입해야지.
피날레를 장식해놓고 후회하실 겁니다. 절 재밌게 해주세요. 어디 보는 거야? 여기라고 여기. 절제된 힘을 예방한다.
오합 기절이고
피할 수 없을까? 어디서 감히
얘는 배로 진피하지.
더 버텨주실 수 있죠? 차! 이건 어때요? 질척대지 말고 이제 그만 쓰러져! 후회하실 겁니다.
오합 기절이고
Okay, so all of the runs I showed so far were using Spirit's Breath. In case you're doing the fast speed build, here's a quick little example run of the fast speed build. This is being done at RC 14. You can see I already have 52% damage increase, but I'm still not going to be able to one-shot without Death Break, even though at RC 8, the Spirit's Breath version was one-shotting without Death Break. So you can see the big loss in damage that occurs. Okay, so the fight starts, and you can see at the start, same thing as usual, the immunity sets block the S2, and you can see the big difference is that when Vivian uses S3, instead of Spirit's Breath proccing, of course, we get the CR push. Vivian almost instantly jumps to her next turn. And also, compared to the other runs, you see that Vivian's creeping up much closer in turn order than she usually does, not just from the 50% CR push, but also from her increased speed. And then this eventually combined with the 20% CR push on her S1 will allow her to cut in front of the boss. We're just going to speed up to the next section where she uses S3. So now Vivian's turn is coming up, and you can see she's just a little bit ahead of the boss, maybe by about 20%. She has 3s, and we now have immunity buff to block the boss's S2s for the rest of the run. So she was ahead of the boss by a little bit. You could drop a couple of speed probably. You would want to check yourself because since we're taking a bunch of turns to get up until this point, even a couple of speed is going to have a big effect on where Vivian is at that point in time. Also, since Vivian has to not skip her S1 turn to get her S3 up, she's going to be stealing 1 Rift Counterforce. And you'll see at the very end that actually steals Wukong's turn, who is our primary DPS. So the missing damage from Wukong's S1, combined with the lack of damage from Vivian herself, since we had to steal a lot of her stats to give her this much speed, means that we just barely miss out on a one-shot kill. So that's pretty much it. I know we still have RC 15 and 21 devices, but with Spirit's Breath, we had 100% one-shot at RC8, and without Spirit's Breath, it was close enough that I think, beyond the first 2 Death Break chances, Adin has a 3rd chance to land Death Break after the boss uses S3, and we probably had enough damage to kill just off of that Death Break alone. 3 Death Break chances gives you a 99.66% chance to land at least 1 Death Break, which is pretty good odds. Also, if you just maybe gave everybody Rage or Destruction sets, you might be able to one-shot without any Death Breaks with the non-Spirit's Breath team as well. At RC15, you can get a big damage boosting device for Wukong. This gives you a couple of options. You could try swapping Wukong to a build that makes him more viable in PvP and PvE, just keeping in mind that he does need immunity set even though he doesn't really normally use it in PvP. And everybody else, you can start stealing their gear, start stealing their artifacts, except for Spirit's Breath of course, and make sure they all have immunity on them, and try to keep the right speed tunings too. My Adin has my symbol of unity. I need that back. At RC21, you get the device, which makes it so if you have no Soul Weavers, you get immunity buff for the whole fight. That plus 3 warrior devices lets Wukong just soul the rift pretty easily. There's a separate video on that in the description if you want to see it. Aside from that, this team was more for fun than for practical use. I don't even know if anyone's going to use this, but if you do, have fun.